Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to everybody who's here in the audience in the CPR conference room and to all of you on Zoom for joining us. This is a moment of celebration for CPR as we launch the second lecture in our 50th anniversary series. CPR turns 50 in November this year, a momentous occasion for the institution. And there could be no better way to mark this moment for the institution than to have speaking in this lecture series, Professor Devesh Kapur. Devesh Kapur has in more ways than one mentored this institution and all of us. So you can just blame him for everything. There are so much of who we are as an institution, who we are as scholars, who we are as researchers, who we are as policy practitioners with a deep interest in research is owed to Professor Devesh Kapur. The amount of time and energy he has spent with us, helping us evolve into who we are as individuals, but always keeping at the back of our mind the collective institutional culture of what has made CPR the institution it is today, owes itself to the generosity of his time and his mentorship. So in more ways than one, Devesh, having you here in this moment for CPR, it's both a moment of celebration as well as a moment of sobriety for the institution as it comes to terms with many of the very difficult realities that it has confronted in these last few months and the big challenges it faces as we go forward. And the one thing that helps us as an institution really comes from so much that you have taught us about what it takes to build an institution, what it takes to hold an institutional culture together, but perhaps most importantly, what it takes to really celebrate the values and purpose of public institutions and how deeply embedded they are in the values of of higher education institutions, work that has been so central to your contribution to the public policy and education world in India. So for us, in this complex moment, to have you here to celebrate and to talk to us is really, really very, very special. And I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your short visit to India to be here with us, to give us this talk on a really important new book, Violence, Order, and the State. I think as you will hear Devesh talk about this book, you will see glimpses of what he has mentored at CPR. So again, you can blame him for what our scholars and researchers say. But really, so much of what this book presents is very much about many of the issues that we grapple with over here, trying to understand empirically and in a clinical way the unfolding dynamics of different aspects of the Indian state, how it has contributed to its to nurture its institutions, the limitations of those institutions, and the big questions that we as a community of scholars and policy practitioners need to be asking of our public institutions in order to be able to strengthen them and building them towards the goal of more robust democratic institutions. So we are really looking forward to your talk. Once again, Devesh, thank you very much for being you, for mentoring this institution, and for being here to celebrate with us.
Thank you, Yamini. After an introduction like that, I fear it can only go downhill. CPR has been my intellectual home, and I have learned much more than I have ever been able to give. And I have been extremely proud of my association with this institution. I think we all know it's facing many challenges. But I very much hope it will continue to be my intellectual home as it has been for many of you, so in the future. I'll come back to some of the issues related to this later, but for now, I'll just focus on this book on internal security in India, violence, order, and the Indian state. So the book is edited with Amit Ahuja, who some of you may know, who's just a wonderful young scholar And it includes actually contributions by several people, some of who are here, who have been associated with CPR. Uh, so broadly speaking, how we got to this book, like many of you recognize that insurgencies, terrorist attacks, various types of caste, communal violence, large-scale massacres, mob violence, etc. All of these have claimed many more lives than all of India's wars combined, by order of magnitude. However, we found that after a sharp upswing in the 1980s and 1990s, most indicators on violence have come down in the past 2 decades. And this drop in violence, its meaning, its implications, we felt were largely have gone unnoticed. And so to understand that, that was the purpose of this book. Now, internal security it's a very broad subject. Precisely because of that, we have brought in this volume both academics, practitioners, as well as people from civil society. The academics have come from economics, political science, history, law, and anthropology. Just because we believe that this is a subject that requires multiple disciplinary lens. It's not a simple subject to examine. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is first to just sort of focus on the links between violence and state building, give you some broad trends of order and violence in India, take you through some plausible explanations of what might be explaining these trends, and just a very, very brief look at what the future might hold. So one of the things I think we wanted to place sort of violence and order is in the context of state building. All state building in any country in the world has been accompanied with considerable or substantial amounts of violence. State building is inherently a violent process. The reason is that the very definition of a state is that a state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within its territory. And to get that monopoly, you have to wipe out all other sources of violence. That's what a monopolist does. And that process is going to be violent. And whether you see the history of the United States, where in the Civil War, it lost 2% of its population. If India had something like that, that would be 30 million people. That's not a trivial amount, if you think of. You look at the Glorious Revolution in the UK, you look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, all of these have been accompanied by not a few deaths, but literally millions of deaths. Look at the making of modern China. Look at the making of modern Indonesia, Vietnam. All of these states have been accompanied by extreme amounts of violence. If anything, the puzzle is the opposite. Why has India witnessed so little violence? If you look at it in a comparative context, not why India has got so much violence. Now, the book has a very particular approach, and I want to emphasize that. That approach is not the only way you can look at it. It's just that in our book, we have chosen this path, which is it is a very statist approach. Why? Because internal security is a core responsibility of any state. And the state's approach points to long-term pathologies that are sustained across governments run by different political parties. I want to emphasize the book is not about what one party did or the other. It's about a long-term process of state building and violence sort of in the country. And we know the state's behavior is consequential. The state in many countries, and perhaps especially our own, is not just an institution that manages violence. The state is also a cause of violence in many different contexts. So just to sort of give a very sort of limited framework, right? If you think about law and order public order and security of the state, think of it in sort of concentric circles, right? Not most issues that we think about, the normal day-to-day crime, etc., is sort of law and order issues. But not all law and order issues are public order issues, right? If there's a homicide, it's a law and order issue. But if there's a riot or if there are major strikes, that's a public order issue. But not all public order issues have implications for the security of the state. Only very specific types of violence have implications for the security of the state. And two examples which we are all aware of is terrorism and insurgencies, because the target is very much specifically, it's the state. So I'll take you through some broad trends, and I know many of you will have questions on the data, which I will come to some later. So we look at trends on 4 levels of violence and order, right? One is just interpersonal violence. Crime is the usual thing, but since we know crime data in India is, pretty crappy, we focus on homicide, not because it's great data, but it's the least worst data in our crime data. The second is sort of disorder and social instability. This is labor strife, student unrest, riots, election violence. The third is what I call intergroup violence, of which communal violence is the one that has most sort of plagued our country. And the last is violence that is directed at the state. And I'll focus especially on sort of insurgencies. So this is sort of homicide data, like for India. So what you see is the sort of red line is sort of world average.
Make sure everyone on Zoom can hear you. I'm giving you both mics.
Okay. And worldwide, actually, homicide rates have declined, but homicide rates in India have declined considerably faster than the worldwide average. Homicide rates in India have declined by 40% relative to population since 1990. Homicide rates in India are considerably less than many comparable countries like Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, and the US, of course. An order of magnitude less compared to South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, actually. In general, Africa and Latin America are much more violent than Asia. Within Asia, South Asia is more violent than Southeast Asia, and the least violent is East Asia. That's the sort of broad trends. If we apply the homicide rate of 1990 to the population since then, if that rate of homicide rate had continued in India, about 400,000 people more would have died. That's a very large number. And that just tells you about things. Sometimes things you don't see are as important as things that you do see. This is data on sort of riots. If you look at this curve, right, broadly, it's an inverted U. And what I'm going to show you a whole range of data on violence, which has an inverted U structure, which is that violence, in this case, riots, it begins to increase from the late 60s. It climbs up over the 70s and 80s, flattens out in the 90s. And since then, it begins to decline. If you normalize by population, riots today are at a historic low. This is strikes. This is since 1990. If I take it back to 1950, which I've done in some other work, you'll see that same U-shaped curve. Now, I'll come to it. All these data have lots of problems. Let's be very clear. But those problems would affect the levels, but not the trends. So it might be much higher, but the broad trends would still be pretty much the same. The one thing that we see, according to official data, is protests. Protests officially at least are classified as ones that are non-violent. And that you see has seen a very sharp increase. The reason it ends in 2016 is that the Home Ministry just stopped reporting them. So it doesn't mean protests have ended. It's just that now we are reasonably sure the data is gathered. It's not reported. So it's not that, we are living, well, we may be living in a Ram Rajya, but we'll come to that later. So intergroup violence. So as some of you know, one of the most well-known data sets on Hindu-Muslim violence has been the Wilkinson data. That ended in 1995. This is official GOI data since then on incidents, fatalities, and number killed since 1996. Now, what's interesting is that, as you see, the fatalities data ends in 2017, not because there have not been any fatalities since, but again, the Home Ministry now in parliamentary questions, the way it reports the data when asked about communal violence is number of FIRs filed, not by fatalities. So of course, if you don't file an FIR, by definition, there is no violence. Now, what about anti-state violence? If you look at insurgencies, this is Jammu and Kashmir since the insurgency began in 1988 by total incidents, the death of security forces, civilians, and insurgents. It's pretty clear of the trend, which of course has flattened out. We all know this continues to simmer, but the vast bulk of violence occurred in the 90s and sort of 2000s. This is violence in the Northeast. You see a pretty similar trend, a decline. This is of course pre-Manipur. So, but I think even when you take that, the broad trend will not change substantially. The third is sort of left-wing sort of extremism. You see also a decline, but the decline is less steep, is less marked. But broadly speaking, you see these trends are all sort of downward sloping. This is not in the book, which I've more constructed recently, which is all insurgencies, Punjab, Kashmir, left-wing extremism, Northeast. And you see very much this inverted U-shaped curve, right? You see the Punjab one begins in the early 80s, really spikes up, is the main, and then drops very rapidly. Then you see Kashmir becoming by far the biggest one. Then it's followed by Northeast, which declines, after which we see more with left-wing extremism. But I think the inverted U is very much clear that the bulk of the violence and fatalities occurs in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. This is the sort of breakup of the fatalities by the different insurgencies. What I want to just highlight to you is the most civilian casualties have actually been in the Maoist insurgency by far. One should also note that the ratio of security forces killed to insurgents is also the highest in the left-wing extremism. The bulk of these have been, in fact, all of the bulk have been Central Armed Police forces. The bulk of army casualties have, of course, been in Kashmir. So if we look at sort of other forms of disorder or violence, whether it's student protests, electoral, caste, hijackings, assassinations, in virtually all of them, we see somewhat, similar trends. The last sort of hijacking occurred in the late 90s. Since then, there hasn't been any. From the 70s to the 90s, every few years, there were hijackings. The one exception, which we all know, is targeted communal violence, in this particular case, lynching, which undoubtedly has increased in the last few years. So if you look at student violence, you see how incredibly large was the increase. from the 50s to the 80s. After that, unfortunately, official data just vanishes. Then it reappears after 2014. And so all this is official data. And the gaps are mainly because it's very hard to find it. It's not that it's not there. Now, this is the mirror image of violence, which is security force fatalities over time, breaking down by civil police, the Central Armed Police Forces, Indian Army, and total. I think in the next graph, you'll see very starkly this inverted U by decade, right? It builds up, really amplifies in the 80s and 90s, and then it begins to come down, right? When there are very large civilian casualties, there will be casualties in the security forces. And so this, I think, really reinforces on the flip side. A different way, which we try to look at it, is this is sort of debates in the Rajya Sabha when classified by the word riots and communal violence. This is annual average, right? You see exactly the same pattern, which is the questions asked in the Lok Sabha about riots or about communal violence. You really see them increasing in the decade of the 1980s and 90s, and then you see this sort of decline. And so I think the point here is basically that all different ways of looking at this phenomenon are broadly consistent with this rise, rapid increase, 80s and 90s, and then a gradual decline in the past 2 decades. Now, the big question is, whenever it comes to this type of data, the sources and quality. Now, data on violence over time on any one of these, there is no other data other than official data. Bad, terrible, whatever it is, that is the only source. With all its limitations, that's the one source. But this is not from just, it's a lot of this is from parliamentary questions and answers. It's, as you all know, that data on violence and crime is not collected by the central government. The central government only collates the data. The data is collected by the states. Law and order is a state subject, and it is just sent up to the center, which puts it together, and that's how it's sort of reported. However, the center can choose not to report data on certain things. The center doesn't make up its own data, although nowadays I don't want to venture into that, but at least over the long run, that's these are larger story. Now, just to do we did 2 checks about comparing official data with data sources that is used worldwide. So if I showed you that graph on protests, now worldwide, sort of researchers use a database out of Stockholm called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. It's a very the sort of world standard. Unfortunately, that started only in 2016. The protest data ends in 2016. So that's the only year I can compare this to. And you can see that official GOI data is an order of magnitude higher than the so-called gold standard data set used by researchers. So it is just not the case that the GOI is somehow giving you much lower numbers and researchers are giving you the right number. In fact, the researchers are way off. To give you another one, as you know, we talked about the Varshney-Wilkinson data set. This is the official MHA numbers from a variety of different sources. This is on incidents. And as you can see, the official data is much, much higher than the data that has been gathered by researchers, which is used by everyone. And what you'll see is that the data on fatalities is much more comparable than the data on incidents. And the reason is when your source is the Times of India, many, many small incidents happen where there are injuries, but no fatalities. And that will not be reported in a national newspaper, right? But it will be reported at the local level to the police, so it will count. So I think we should be pretty careful in just believing that some researchers have better data and knowledge. In this case, I seriously question that's the case. So what's driving some of these trends? I think broadly, and I want to be very, very careful. I've used the word plausible, since some of you love the word causal. I'm not going to use that word at all. It's just plausible hypothesis. I think one of the factors in the decline of rural violence is a sharp decline in caste violence. The way landlords could behave with the laborers 40 years ago is simply impossible today. We know that's not the case with religious violence, but caste violence is, the sort of large caste massacres that would occur in the UP and Bihar in the 70s and 80s. They are much, much rarer now. Then demographic trends. Now, the demographic trends, there's a general sense in this literature that if you have a population bulge in the 15 to 24 age group, violence tends to increase. Violence is generally done by, of course, young males. That's the demographic that is much more prone to violence. Now, this is sort of the share of population in the 15 to 24 age group and the trends in homicide rates. There's a slight weak correlation, but it's not really the sort of driving force, it seems. I think one, and when you compare it with Latin America and Africa, really there's much more limited access to guns, and especially much more limited access to ammunition. All the guns are the country pistols, but none of those semi-automatics that are so prevalent there, which can do. And yes, India has a drug problem, but it's nothing like what it is in Latin America and parts of Africa. Then we know the usual thing, is it because we have police? Of course, you can take it for any year. This is sort of the G20. India has the lowest police force per unit population. If you look at judges, it's not that India's crying, the judges are solving or whatever cases, we know it's exactly the opposite. If you look at incarceration rates, India is by far the lowest, right? I mean, the US is a complete outlier. But even if you compare with the Brazils, even Canada, which we think is a peaceful country, India, I mean, you could joke that, because all our criminals are in parliament, they're not in jail. But nonetheless, the fact is that in general, we don't have, it's not that the crime is low because everyone is in jail. No, they're all out. Now, I think one is, it's very much the case that there has been a federalization of the law and order machine. It is absolutely the case that law and order constitutionally was a state subject. And over the past 60 years, dozens of reports from each finance commission to lots of police commissions have pleaded with states to put more money on police. The police are always, the civil police is to security what public health is to health. It's the front line, it's the first thing. And the states have always severely underinvested. And then when violence breaks out, they plead to the center to send central forces. So you see this massive increase in central forces that has occurred, right? It was 5,000 roughly in the mid-50s, 60,000 by the mid-60s, 500,000 by 1990, and it's about 1 million now. The ratio of caps to the army has increased from about 1 to 10 to 1 to 1 in the past 50 years. There's been a dramatic change in the structure of the non-military security forces in the country. One of the positive externalities is that the role of the army in internal security, what was called aid of civilians, has really declined. This is Nonetheless, when we think of state presence in terms of policing, it's by area and by population. So what you really see is a 25-fold increase by area since independence. In places like Madhya Pradesh, or there was absolutely no police presence at all in the 50s and 60s. All that has gradually been changing. So while the states have been underinvesting, nonetheless, you see this perceptible change over time. Now, the institutional infrastructure has also expanded. There have been new agencies created, new laws, while the state police continues to be underfunded, understaffed, under-equipped. And in this book, I'll show you there's a chapter which looks at the growth of private security forces. Private security forces today are the 10th largest employer in the country. And it's 3 times larger. This includes everything from Darwans to, these agencies that have, security forces. These are the agencies, the coercive arms of the Indian state. I think it's very small, so I'm sorry for that. But it's everything, a lot of them were created in the 1960s and then again in the 1980s and early 2000s. It is not correct to say that all of this is somehow a creature of the current regime. These are all created in the past. Their use might have changed. The other is, of course, a whole set of laws, right? I think I'm not going to go through the acronym. Many of you are very familiar. As one of these laws is shut down, a new reincarnation comes by, so on and so forth. And so this is the sort of coercive institutional apparatus. There's a legal apparatus, and then there are the security, the kinetic and non-kinetic arms of the Indian state. Now, what has all this meant for the broader questions on civil liberties and democracy, right? So I think what we discussed very clearly, the absence of violence is not the absence of fear. A very nice piece by the philosopher Hamia Srinivasan, and she said, the exposure to threats and assaults on dignity creates an insidious uncertainty which closes down the possibility of individuals having control over themselves, right? And without some guarantee of safety, we cannot plan, we cannot dream, right? And so you don't, just because, we know in many countries with strong authoritarian governments, there is actually very low violence. There's very low violence in the People's Republic of China, actually, but that doesn't mean there's very little fear. So one should really be very clear on the distinctions between these two. So, of course, what India has done, as none of this is news to any of you, there's very weak oversight mechanisms, judicial forbearance for human rights violations in the name of national security, extrajudicial killings, torture, all of these are very much par for the course. Nothing here is new. It has been long sustained by all governments at the state level, at the national level. So what are some of the organizing themes in this book? So we sort of just, we begin with by showing that there's been improvement, there's been decline in violence, and in part because of an increase in state capacity, which has been lopsided in favor of the federal government. And one of the things is that right from the writing of the Constitution, this was there. The Indian Constitution privileges national security over individual civil liberties in multiple ways. This is not something that has happened recently. This was in our DNA, so to speak. Then there's a very nice paper on the genesis and how the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in the name of national security, and in some places has been there for decades on end. So what was supposed to be a law for an emergency has become a daily practice. Sushant, who's here, has authored one of the papers on, and Paul Staniland on another, where they've looked at the internal security doctrine, how it has evolved over space and time. So if you have questions, to direct it at him. Then there's a paper on the role of the army, especially in counterinsurgency, the creation of Rashtriya Rifles, and how actually its very success tactically might have been a strategic failure, in that the army's role in external security got undermined as a result. Then Mr. Azad is here. He was with the cabinet secretariat, and he's written a wonderful paper on the size of the Central Armed Police Forces and how it has doubled over 3 decades, and the factors that are being driving it. Okay, just 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we had a very nice chapter, unfortunately draft from Mr. Shakti Sinha, who regrettably passed away in the middle of this whole process. And his chapter is on the core institutional arm of the Indian state that manages internal security, which is the Ministry of Home Affairs. And there's a chapter on the IB from Saikat Tata. Now, IB, of course, is part of what we might call the sort of deep state. Really very hard to research it. So much of this you can, I don't think so we can do this in depth and do it justice by a long shot. Then these are some new agencies this is the Rapid Action Force, and there's a very nice paper by Nirvikar Jassal and Mr. Hanif Qureshi, who's the IG of Haryana Police, on how the RAF has been used. But also, it's very important, right, that when it is not used, you really see when violence breaks out, like in Manipur, it's abundantly clear that if you have sustained violence for more than 24 hours, very much the state is involved. The state today has absolutely the capacity to manage violence if it chooses to. And that's the big question, is the if. Then Sana Ghosh is an anthropologist who's really been doing excellent work on how the induction of women in the BSF, how it's sort of changing its internal organizational structures and the challenges in managing that. Then we have sort of papers on the police, separate papers by Akshay Mangla, Nirvikar Singh, who's an economist who looks at sort of budgetary expenditures, the fiscal side of the police. And Beatrice Janguri, she looks at the police as a labor force. As you know, the constabulary in the police were extremely badly treated. The fact that you see them quite brutalized is because they have been treated quite, brutally. The way, surprisingly, in many parts, they don't have leave ever. They work 7 days a week on 12-hour shifts. Something, if we were to allow it in our factories, we would go apoplectic, but we think it's completely fine for these guys like to do it. So if they behave badly, it is because we have created conditions for them to behave badly. Then the paper by Arjun Jaidev and looks at sort of private security and how it's been growing. Now, the future, well, I have no great insights about the future, but just some basic sort of speculations. I think when it comes to insurgencies, there's no doubt the state's coercive power, it can manage insurgency today. It's like an elephant, it can just sit on it and squeeze the breath out of it. But fundamentally, I think we should have no doubts that they will continue to simmer unless there are political settlements. And this is especially the case with Kashmir and the Northeast. The Quotidian law and order will continue because no political party has any interest in police reforms. I have gone through at least 50 different commission reports on the police, state level, national level. All of them say virtually the same thing. Everyone agrees it should be done, and nothing happens, basically. I don't see that changing. I think many of these things will matter on how the economy evolves, obviously. If you don't have growth or growth is not inclusive, it creates certain conditions. And of course, politics is always there, right? And political polarization and the overlap between political and social cleavages. But I think fundamentally, when we think about violence in the state, it's about the legitimacy of the state itself. And I go back to James Madison, and he said, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place oblige it to control itself. What I would like to conclude with saying, we have actually pretty much reasonably, not fully, done the first part. The second is a long ways to go. Thanks.
Thank you. As promised, this was really fantastic and really gave us so much rich empirical data to better understand the relationship between violence and the state, challenging many things, many assumptions that we have. But we are now open for questions. May I request those on Zoom to please put their questions on. We take a first round in the room, and then we'll come to Zoom and go back and forth. Please keep your questions short. And do we need to take a mic? Yeah. So Amit, then Harish.
Thank you. Thanks, Devesh. I'm Amit Mukherjee. I'm at RSIS. Fantastic. I've seen the book from beginning. Fantastic talk. I thought the ending was too cryptic by half, right? I mean, you know that you would be expecting that question. What specifically, and which specific institutions do you think you would want the state to control itself? And I could talk about, the enforcement directorate, police reforms, sort of checks and balances. So if I could ask you about that, which specific institutions you would want for the state to control itself? Thank you.
Just give it back.
No, just I was just why you had the spike during the 60s and 70s. I thought you would have the spike in the opening decade of after independence, when the new state was just emerging. So why did it spike and why did it come down? 60s, 70s.
Thanks, Devesh. I just have a very basic question. As someone who doesn't work on this, what's your sense of the evolution of the agency of the kind of internal security bureaucracy versus the political class, right? Like, are they even capable of internal reform in the sense that they get the political will or convince whoever is in power to do it? Or is it your sense that they've become more politically compliant over time? Or is that just a, kind of misunderstanding?
You want to respond to this cluster and then we'll take a second.
Look, of the agencies of the state, whether ED or so on, look, they are instruments. They don't have agency completely on their own. What I was basically referring to is, in the end, it's the MHA and who's the minister and the prime minister. I mean, let's be very clear that these are political, these instruments can be politicized to the degree that the powers that be want to politicize them, and they can be less so if they. So fundamentally, when I meant that, what I meant was the apex of political power. If they chose to control them, they can. If they don't want to, I'm I think there's absolutely, in my mind, clarity on that. Harish, so in general, I think the 50s, rural India, social control in rural India was really with the landlords. There wasn't much change. Broadly, the feudal system was social control. Broadly, industrialization had not yet really, the big things comes later. So you don't have all the industrial strife. Growth in the 50s was pretty robust, right? So there was still the idealism post-independence, the political class, right? It's really after 67 when the politics begins to change. Growth really declines from the mid-60s, right? And all the sort of disorder that begins, the strikes, which culminates, big social movement, Jayaprakash, you really begin to see now disorder really beginning, right? And the politics of the country completely changes, right? And so that's when you begin to see all these things begin to emerge. That's my understanding. Does it have autonomy? I think I'll leave the question to Mr. Hazard. I mean, I'm only observing. He was.
I actually speak on this every day, even yesterday.
I just give you the mic, sorry. Just-
I can speak very loudly too.
No, the room won't get to it.
Okay. Well, if you're talking about the internal security apparatus not being able to reform itself, or the political will not being there, then let me tell you at the very outset that today the police wants to reform itself. They're saying कि हमें reform करो. Lekin the politician says, no, you're absolutely all right the way you are. I had I was the IB station chief in Madhya Pradesh. So I came to Delhi for some meeting and I met one of the stalwarts in the cabinet. Stalwart means very high up. And I told him, why don't you initiate police reforms? So he says, tell me which CM will agree to it. And I'm telling you, this is of the horse's mouth or whatever. To which CM will agree? I said, mere muh se nikal gaya. There are many CMs who don't agree to many right things. He says, that's all right. But then ultimately is the CM. So I said, the 1861 Act, that was the central act, right? And even now you're trying to bring many things through your central acts. And you get a few states on board, which is your area, you can do it. It was not done. Today, even, as Devesh said, there are so many police reform models and model acts. In fact, Soli Sorabji had given an act, which was a very good act. Even the central government didn't introduce it in Delhi itself. So the acts are a mere caricature of what they actually should be. Second point about the enforcement directorate. Sanjay Mishra is an outstanding officer. I know, outstanding. But he uses everything against the opposition. That's a very serious issue. But look at one thing. The opposition also is not looking at the principle of extensions, but it looks at ED because it hurts them the most. The cabinet secretary is going on for 5 years merrily. He was going on for 5-6 years merrily even earlier in other regimes, right? The home secretary rolls on for another 5 years. You know why? Because they don't make any difference to our lives. So that also shows you what is the kind of work they do. If cabinet secretary doesn't do the right coordination on many issues, and we have been raising this on the TV, then there is a problem. There's a serious problem. So then, what happens? Somebody was talking about this Bajrang case, that famous, that wrestler's case. There is still a battle ahead. The battle ahead is that the charge sheet has been filed. And after the charge sheet has been filed, the charge has to be framed. Now, for early framing of charge, you have to have a competent set of prosecution. Now, where does the prosecution team come from? It comes from the government. So the government doesn't initiate, what do you do? So the women's organization came to me and they said, "Ki, Sahab, kya karna chahiye?" I said, do you know that the POXO case can only be closed by the High Court? So you should say that this closure of case by the Delhi police is wrong. So you see the interplay of the forces on one. But I'll tell you one thing in the end. 30% of the caliber in the IPS, IAS, military is absolutely tops. Tops mean in terms of integrity, in terms of professionalism. The point is they are not there at the right places. They are superseded or so how we can evolve a mechanism to put the right person at the right place is a huge problem in our democracy. And that is why we are suffering.
Thank you. I'll just read out some questions, Devesh, that have come on Zoom. One, I would like to ask why state as a political entity doesn't focus on building cohesion inside society rather than taking every issue as law and order, for instance, in the case of the northeastern periphery of India. The next question. So essentially, the question is asking why does the state as a political entity focus so much on converting every aspect of social disorder into a matter of law and order rather than building cohesion within society? The second question is on trying to understand the level of violence due to scarcity of drinking water. And then the third one wants to understand the same thing, decline in violence, caste-based violence, but not decline in religious violence. And I'll just take a fourth, which is a slightly meaty one, which essentially is trying to ask, why is it, so, we have seen a lot of chipping away of federalism in different aspects of center-state relations in the last few years. If you look at your data, do you see any difference in federalization of security since 2014?
I think
Let me
I-
give more mics, please.
I'll start with the drinking water and violence because I have no idea. I guessed it. I'm sure it's an issue somewhere and someone should do it, but I can't speak to it. I think, look, obviously, law and order, using the machinery of law and order should sometimes be the instrument of last resort. But sometimes it's better to nip things in the bud, and it can be like in communal violence. If you want to stop the violence, and it should be to the first resort. I think in this other book that I'm working on, our basic approach to the Northeast and the decline of violence is the 2C approach, cash and coercion. We basically buy off every rebel group. It's become an extortionary racket on a massive scale. And that's true of Kashmir also. It's not the militants. The militants are foot soldiers in most cases. There is whole layers of politicians, bureaucrats, even the IB, intelligence, security apparatus. Everyone is involved in making money off this. And everyone is making money. And there isn't really any interest in really solving the problem because everyone's happy in that sense. And so, of course, there is an incentive to keep it as a law and order problem, because then everyone is, everyone can continue. I'm not saying there are no law and order issues, but it becomes amplified because of these incentives. I mean, why caste violence may have declined, but not religious? I think it's fairly obvious. I mean, the nature of our politics is such that some cleavages, it's politically advantageous to amplify them, and some cleavages, it is not politically advantageous. And in the last few decades, it's advantageous to amplify the religious, cleavage by certain political parties. I mean, that's basically it. I think on the federalism thing, this is one case, I think, and I think that has been the case with several issues like primary education, etc. The states have undoubtedly abdicated their responsibilities. If Punjab insists on giving 10,000 crores for electricity subsidies, you have the money, you have chosen to spend it on X and not Y. That is the choice you have made. And then after that, you say, look, the federal government is strong and it is, paramilitary forces are growing. It is because you have chosen it to do so. And this has been something that has been happening over the past 50 years. The states have deliberately chosen to underinvest in public goods. That public goods is public health, primary education, and law and order is a public good. All three are state subjects. All three, the states, there are exceptions, but as a broad, they have absolutely, they are willing to give massive subsidies for irrigation. They're willing to give massive subsidies for electricity. They're willing to keep alive state-owned enterprises that are completely moribund and loss-making. But they're not willing to spend money on public goods. That is the choice they have made. So when we see the federalization, it is a consequence of their choices. And if you have a center that takes advantage of this, it will. But they have allowed it to take advantage.
Rahul?
Next.
No, you go ahead and then we'll come to this. Yeah, I'll just come to you after the round.
Thank you, Devesh, for your talk. While you didn't want to get into the further explanation, the very first sort of like sentence was in some ways puzzle, because what you said.
I thought I'd leave that to you.
No, but what, if I understood you correctly, what you're saying that state building is a violent process, and state building is basically to settle political order. Are we in a moment where a new political order is being created? It means that a new state is being created, which means the byproduct is going to be very, very violent.
No, I think you want to separate state building from nation building. A new nation may be created, but I don't think so. A new state has been created.
And then you, sir. Just can you pass the mic here? Here.
Oh, thank you, Prof. I just wanted to speak a little bit. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the problems with the data that you'd mentioned and why we can assume that those problems will largely affect levels, but not affect our estimate of trends.
I think, see, the data is coming from states, right? So if you take 1 year and one state as one source, right? So what you're going to get is you're going to get biases in different ways across states, across political parties, right? So unless you have evidence that there is consistent bias, even if the political party changes, and the states we see, there's a lot of change. Unless we have some evidence of that, that's why I'm going with this assumption. I don't have any contrary information that would make me feel otherwise. That's all. So I'm not saying I'm 100% confident of this, but this is largely my interpretation.
Thank you, Professor, for the interesting report that the presentation you had presented. Something that you would mention about Punjab, and that's almost correct about almost every state in India. That's my question arises from that only. The failure of law and order is definitely an electoral question. But if a good law and order situation is there, that will become a question of electoral politics in the country. So if some state go work on law and order, it would not reflect into the electoral question. But if like your Manipur, where the crisis is going on, that would become an electoral issue, or the rights that happen, that would become an electoral issue. So what's your point on that? Why would the state take such thing? And the second question arises from there will be, law and order is to strengthen the civil liberties. But we had seen that the maintaining of law order is also creating the problem of civil liberty. Like we had in Kashmir, on the name of law and order, we had the crisis of civil liberties. We had it in the Northeast with the SPA and all things. And we had seen in the Punjab in 80s and all. So what's your take on both the points? Why should the state, what is there electorally, how they can redefine this as it as a priority? And the second thing about the civil liberty. Thank you.
Just give me two questions from here.
Do you see any shift in the character of the Indian state? If at all, does it have any effect or relationship with the nature of violence and how to deal with it?
There was just one comment on a question earlier who said that why does Indian state treat it as a law and order issue and not a political solution? I think the standard principle has been that you first bring in the security forces, bring the level of violence down, and then undertake political activity. And a success story, which we forget, two success stories, Mizoram and Punjab. The fact is that Tripura also, but Mizoram and Punjab are usually significant because we are, of course, in this environment, we forget that Mizoram was a major insurgency, and it's the only state where the Indian Air Force actually physically bombed a state because the state had been completely cut off. The army could not reach there. And what India did with the villages program, is something which people forget. And it was a huge level of the state violence was oppression of a different order from what we see today. And then the political activity took place under Rajiv Gandhi, and they came back. And similarly in Punjab, what we witnessed. So the idea in principle is that we first bring in, heavy state hand, bring down the violence level, and then undertake political activity to bring them back into the political mainstream. But the second part is very tough. It often doesn't happen, as we see in Nagaland and other places. But it was usually violent, oppressive state, bringing the level of violence down and then get the
Economy and everything crumbled after that.
I think she had a question and we can come back.
So we've, spoken for a long time about the difficulty or if not impossibility of reforming the police in India, but can you name a country or long-standing democracy that actually succeeded in reforming its police?
So let's start with the first thing. Is law and order an electorally salient subject? I think if you ask about the politics of UP and Bihar, I would argue, yes, it is. Very much so that Lalu lost because there was a sense the state was becoming lawless. Very much so, Mulayam and the Samajwadi Party, there's a strong feeling that that was one of their Achilles' heel. So while, excellent law and order might not give you lots of votes, but the lack of law and order, definitely. So one is the short term, right, on the electoral. But then there's the medium and long term. There is no doubt that states which have poor law and order have poor economies. You will not get investment. So you get into this low-level equilibrium. One of the things about order, right? We always have this sense, it's not just India elsewhere, that somehow order is some right-wing thing. Only right-wing people want order. With order, you may not get good things, but it's very difficult to get good things if you don't have order. We don't know the price of disorder. When you see 30 million people dying in China, that's when you realize what disorder means, right? What we see now in Manipur, that state is will be on its knees for years because of what happened, because we could not maintain order. So it's not that if Manipur didn't have this, it would be great. I'm not saying that. So it's a sort of asymmetric. Great order it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for other things to follow. But we should not lose sight that it is a necessary condition. Has the character of the Indian state changed? You mean the central government?
Not the government. Government's coming.
Right.
Social base and dynamics.
Yeah. So there are. In my work, I see many conflicting trends which I'm not able to fully grasp. One is the social base of the Indian state has undoubtedly changed. It's a much more representative state today than it was, right? In the 50s, it was basically an upper caste state, right? There were no women. Today, yes, women are still very underrepresented, but compared to the 50s, much more. Lower caste, people, it's not just about caste, but it's about location. If you look at where the IAS came from, the civil services, they were all from the metros. Today, many of them are coming from small towns. In fact, people in the metros are not joining the civil service and army. The composition, social composition, and Sushant, I'm sure, can speak better, has really changed. It's no longer the upper elite who would join the army. Now it's again from the smaller towns that's coming. So the social composition of the state has changed. It is much more, it is more representative of India than ever before. Yeah, but I mean, the one exception. Yeah, that is now an extension of the state as well. I think the one area where it is definitely not represent, or it's not grown, is the representation of Muslims, right?
Representation
Of like Muslims. That has undoubtedly hardly changed. It was low in the 50s because the Muslim elite had left, and it has undoubtedly not increased anything like the other social groups have increased.
I think the two factors are critical in the state character. One is social dynamics, which you just talked. The second is economic capabilities at the individual level, which really transform their behavior.
No, but the fiscal capacity of the Indian state, India is a richer country, the state has more resources. There's no doubt about the fact. I mean, the surveillance capabilities of the Indian state are pretty good. Now, that has, of course, the other side of the coin. Because if you don't have all the safeguards, a greater surveillance capabilities can be misused as well. Gilles, excellent question. Very hard everywhere, as we are seeing in the US, right? And, police reforms, like most reforms of any institution, they're always ongoing processes. It's never that, there's you go from 0 to 100, right? But the question is, are you going to go, whatever you are now at, C+, can you move to B-? That at least I think is possible, and countries have done that. I mean, if you look at the turn of the century, what the British police was before the creation of Scotland Yard, what the US federal police was before the creation of the FBI, these were all institutional reforms that fundamentally changed the character of the internal security apparatus. And so you're right, it's very hard, but I see, Singapore, Hong Kong, police were extremely corrupt. Both changed a lot. There's one up.
Just one second, let me give you a mic, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. My question is actually in relation to the changing nature of the Indian state. I'm also thinking that given the context of this, the enhancement in the internal security apparatus, the increase of the CAPS forces, and also the kind of strikes that we see in Kashmir and the Northeast, would we also think that maybe the logic of the Indian state is changing? It's not a post-colonial logic anymore. It's now a settler colonial logic, where the logic of extermination and really coming back to the last point that you were making, that, the change that we are not seeing is representation of Muslims. We're not seeing change that, even though that disadvantaged castes are definitely more visible and now coming into mainstream conversations, but they don't have any kind of political power in the terrain, and especially in this security terrain. And so I'm really thinking that even if we think about India-Israel collaborations, we're really thinking about one definite change in the nature of the state is that we are becoming more settler colonial than post-colonial. We're really kind of learning the worst from the West and kind of driving that. And I'm just wondering if all the conversation around security and violence that you're looking at, if you see that kind of trend emerging where the deep state, the external security apparatus, and the internal militarization, they all kind of speak to each other, and that's where I think even Bill's question around police reforms and this question of where do you see police reform? You see police reform becoming militarization of the police. And I think we are headed in that direction. All this talk of tech and AI and drones soon will enter the military apparatus, which will enter the urban security apparatus. And I think there's something there to be thought about there. And especially, I don't understand the expansion of the CAPF in that sense, but what kind of force is that? How do other states across the world have this kind of, a force which is not clearly federal, but not clearly state, sits in the middle and can be.
No, it's very much a federal force. Caps are completely federal.
But how do they get allocated? And is it on the request of the state only, or
It's only a-
okay, great, thanks.
Thanks. Well, I'll just take two questions from Zoom, and then I know there's a few more in the audience. Okay, 3 questions from the audience, and then we'll give you the last word. So you can pick and choose what you want to respond. So sorry, this is reading glasses problem. One question is, if you anticipate that the U curve is of a cyclical nature, and another question wants you to explicate a bit more on the system of incentive structures that sustains insurgency. So we'll start with you, Rashmi, and then we'll come to you. Go ahead.
I'm thinking about police encounters and extrajudicial killings. And that's a trend that seems to have risen now. I don't really know what the case was in the 70s or the 80s. But wondering how we view that, in this context, and is there a reason why that's not a part of your study? Is there no data? Where's the data lying,
Rashmi? Partho has the mic, he'll just give it to you.
I want to sort of get your thought on, the phrase law and order is used. I mean, it is assumed that law and order somehow exists, but actually, I mean, it's not a point, but order can be lawless. I mean, without applying the law, it can be, order can be when you break the law and maintain order, and there is a certain kind of order where you implement the law and then have order. So there are both situations exist. Now, to the extent that what your presentation showed, that when you were showing the growth in both in the police and the courts, to the extent that the judicial system has actually grown much less than the law enforcement, the order enforcing system. Does that sort of orient us towards an order that is not necessarily based on this? So one is I like you about that. And the second is the fact that you say that if you were interested in order that comes along with the enforcement of law, do you look much more at this and administration? And if you are interested in order which may not come along with enforcement of law, and in fact at times may go on, then you could be more interested in CRPF and centralized forces, because their day-to-day local life is done through penetration in the society, through a police station and so on and so forth. While these forces are really order maintaining forces. So do you think that kind of sort of we have moved towards order without necessarily law rather than law and order?
And last question to you.
My name is Kapur, and I would like to speak in English because it will make it easy for me. सर आपने एक बहुत अच्छी स्टेटमेंट दी है एंड दिस इज फ्रॉम द स्कॉलर्स ऑल ओवर द वर्ल्ड स्कॉलर एक ही बात कहते हैं relying completely on the official data. What about the unofficial data? What will happen to the unofficial data? I'm being a student of comparative study in the evolution of histories. मैंने ये देखा है हिस्ट्री के इतने रूप हैं, हर कोई अपने अपने रंग में दिखाता है और सच्चाई का पता नहीं चलता. इधर देखिए, डॉक्टर कहता है कि मुझे सिम्टम चाहिए, बॉडी कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से मुझे कोई मतलब नहीं है, तो क्या होगा मरीज का? जज कहता है फैक्ट्स आई डोंट वांट टू नो, आई वांट द एविडेंस। तो एविडेंस, फैक्ट्स कहाँ गया? तो इस दुनिया में जो कुछ हो रहा है वो सच नहीं है, जो दिखता है वो सच नहीं, सच कुछ और है। तो क्योंकि समय का अभाव है, इसलिए मैं शॉर्ट में ये कहना चाहता हूं, वायलेंस, सफरिंग एंड injustices has always been there since the dawn of history and it will always be there। और ये कहना कि ये कम हो रहा, नहीं, ये बढ़ रहा है। जैसे जैसे पॉपुलेशन बढ़ेगी, डिमांड और सप्लाई का गैप बढ़ेगा, ये सब चीजें बढ़ेंगी। और हिंदुस्तान में क्या हो रहा है, कोई कानून को नहीं मानता, कोई लेफ्ट नहीं जाना चाहता, राइट नहीं जाना चाहता, पुलिस को नहीं सुनता, पॉलिटिशियन कानून को नहीं मानते। कंट्री इज बीइंग रन बाय द माफिया। व्हाट आर वी टॉकिंग अबाउट? What are we talking about? We are run by mafia.
Thanks. I think we got your point. Okay, just last, very short, please.
Lecturing. I heard the presentation, very nice presentation. You have touched upon the state and center relationship, that and the law and order is a state subject. Now, you have said that the collateral reports which are sent by the state to the center whenever they ask for it, so they are forged statements from the state. Now, in the federalism, how the corrective action will be taken by the central government if the states send them not the correct reports at all? Now is the case as every delegate here said that Manipur, Bengal, Punjab, Kashmir, all they're there. How the center, then the people blame the central government. वो कोई सुन नहीं रहा, वहां पे कोई एक्शन नहीं हो रहा, सब चुप करके बैठे हुए हैं। अरे when it is a state subject, you are not giving a correct statement to the central government. वो ये करेगी, इलाज फिर कैसे होगा? Central government कैसे इलाज करेगी उस स्टेट का? That is, I would like to have your views on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Devesh, back to you. Answer all of them in 5 minutes.
I think Rashmi's question and your question on encounter killings. So there is data which we have in the book from NHRC, which gathers with whatever it's thing. You know, one of the interesting thing about encounter killings we note in the book is whenever there are encounter killings, Hyderabad after the raid, UP we know, the people in Delhi and civil liberty groups say, you know, put their head in their hands, what a shame, and the public cheers. The question is, why does the public cheer? There is zero support almost in the public. They applaud the police, right? And many actions that if there is strong public support for action, they will occur. And the heart of the matter, which Rashmi sort of alluded to, is that we have really neglected our district courts. District courts are again a state subject, right? I mean, I find inordinate attention to the Supreme Court. Everything is about the Supreme Court. It should never go even to the High Court, right? Today is, or next year will be the 40th year after the 1984 riots. We still have cases going on. I mean, what type of system that 40 years later, and we are facing the consequences of that in Canada, UK, and Australia, with all the Khalistani things against India, because we absolutely, adamantly, resolutely failed to address it, right? And so, as long as if you see riots, if you see the official data and you ask, then there's cause of riots. What do you think is the single highest cause of riots in India? It's not communal violence or anything. By far, it is land disputes. By far, it's the #1 source of riots in India, because normally, if there's a dispute between two parties, you can't resolve it. You go to the court, you get a settlement, but it's locked up in court for years. So the frustration now comes out in violence. That's why we see so much just as we have severely underinvested the states and the police, they have equally done so with district courts. District courts is not an expensive thing. Some buildings, some judges, and some staff. These are not expensive things. You can see from the Law Commission report from the 1950s, every decade, there are parliamentary reports, Law Commission reports on court pendencies. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows it's increasing. Each time you have one more special court, etc. But the base, which is the district courts, very little. And you have unfilled judges, unfilled, all of that is there. And I think in this, I think we pay on these basics too much attention on the center, the Supreme Courts, apex institutions, because in Delhi, it's easier to look at apex institutions. But we must ask much harder questions on these basics about what the states are doing. I mean, that I think comes out in this book and this work. I'm absolutely clear about that. I think there was a question was, do I anticipate a cyclical nature of the U curve? I anticipate nothing because I have no idea. Of course, this is not like gravity that what goes up must come down. Of course, it can go up. I mean, we thought violence was coming down in the Northeast. Look at the mess we made in Manipur. So there's absolutely no doubt it can go up. I mean, just because it's come down now, I'm only telling you about the past. I simply do not want to say that it cannot occur and occur even more in the future. What am I missing? Mafia Raj. अब इस पर मैं क्या बोलूं? अगर होएगा माफिया राज तो राम राज्य और माफिया राज में बहुत फर्क है क्या?
सर जी एक बात मैं कहना भूल गया. Suffering is a form of violence, and everybody is made to suffer.
I'm suffering now too, actually.
Yeah, that will end up in a violence.
On that note, I hope you won't suffer from the joy of giving us. But thank you. I think thank you, Devesh.
As per the data and the problems here, as is well known, there is problem like insurgency, terrorism, law and order, Punjab, UP, Bihar, law and order, and insurgency and terrorism in Punjab, JNK, Northeast. Recently, we have seen political violence in Bengal, and it is continuing over the years. It started with left CPIM, and then now the Trinamool Congress is continuing with it. So there is problem with the northern states and the eastern states. So would you agree that southern and western India is better in this respect? Because there is no such thing in south and north west of India. Gujarat, Maharashtra, Andhra, Telangana.
All the Naxal thing was all Telangana. All the Bombay blasts, all that communal violence in Gujarat has been.
Still, I mean, economically and politically, they are better governed.
No, that I think is true, but that doesn't mean that they haven't.
Their relationship with God. Okay, on that note, as always with CPR talks, lots to think about and lots to. So thank you very much, Devesh. Really appreciate it. This lived up to its promise.